Good afternoon, everybody. Now, this, in a brief explanation, is about a cover which turned up on eBay, which I bought because I hadn't seen one of the marks before. And it turned out I hadn't seen either of the marks before. So, in brief explanation, I collect First World War. And this particular book um, seems to contain most marks from the First World War. However, it doesn't contain either of the marks on this cover, which is a bit annoying. Um, it does actually contain almost everything, not completely up to date, because 1968, but it's a good basis. Now, this is the cover. Now, when I first saw it, and I was just having a brief look through eBay under the search for World War One Swiss, sorry, French on this one, World War One French. This cover turned up. 1918, right at the end of the war. Clearly a military cover because it's got the initials in the top right-hand corner, and is what on eBay, because it wasn't a very good photograph, I thought was a standard regimental mark, bottom left. So it was just the Sucres. Oh, I can't pronounce it. Pardon me. That taught my hand. Plainly a John Ball mark, temporary use. Now, when France entered the war, it had the largest public debt in Europe, and I gather that hasn't really altered. And every year they were having a campaign to decrease the public debt by taking out what in UK terms was war loans. And it was very, very intense marketing. You can turn up lots of postcards for various dates with the imprint marking on. I have never ever seen one of these postally used though. So it turns out that the main marking I bought it for, subscribed to War Loan, um, it's the only mark I've actually seen of that type at all. A search on images, Google Images, doesn't turn up anything. Not that that's particularly complete, but it turns out that that marking is not particularly of interest. Now, the second mark, Train Sanitaire Improvised, um, turned out to be quite interesting. For one, it's not actually recorded, and as far as I can make out, none of the train um, office marks are actually formally recorded. You can turn up odd articles on the internet um, showing the odd illustration, but there's no listing of what marks were used where. Anyway, if we go back to the cover, it was 1918, just before the Armistice. And at that time, the situation was as follows: 6 permanent hospital trains 109 semi-permanent hospital trains. Um, you're talking about inter-car access at all, stretcher versions. And there was 8 improvised hospital trains for seated wounded and 27 improvised hospital trains for stretcher-bound wounded, which struck me as an awful lot of trains not to have left a vast amount of postal history. Now, an improvised hospital train was 40 vehicles, 33 covered wagons with inter-car gangways. Those were the days when I used to go Sunday school outings, and we used to run up and down the gangways between carriages. But these were just connections between the carriages, converted, lit by lanterns, converted into stretcher carrying wagons, transporting 396 people at a time. Hang on, that's gone back the wrong way. Here we are. There was comparatively limited personnel, 48 doctors to 396 patients. Well, it's 2 doctors, it's 48 personnel. But they do list an administrative officer, and one must assume that the administrative office is where these marks were applied. You can look Commander Capel up on the internet. It's in French, but he did a very good article in the latter part of the First World War on these trains. The purpose of them, he states quite simply, to evacuate the sick and wounded in a primary manner, that is to say, before any treatment other than immediate treatment over distances that should theoretically be moderate and as directly related to the risk of worsening the condition of the transported soldiers. The 1914 regulations summarized: disinfect and pack the wounds, evacuate the wounded for subsequent treatment. The improvised trains, which were mainly converted cattle carriages, etc., as it said in Commander Capel's report, quickly became an additional source of suffering for the wounded and worsened their condition, as because they were generally not interlinked carriages, they could not be monitored during transport. One of the consequences of that is that the individual train runs were comparatively short. So there was lots of stops along the way. Dispatching them off to individual hospitals, the report says they were done in full batches. I suspect it was done where there was space in the particular hospital. Now, top left of the photograph, it clearly states sanitaire improvised. And you have got 3 medical attendants, and presumably the gentleman on the chair is either in charge or he's a patient. But that appears to be just a normal passenger carriage. You can turn up postcards of these things. That's actually a cattle carriage which was used to transport wounded English soldiers. There's a similar one for France, and that's actually a mixed train. It's got passenger carriages here, and it's got the cattle carriages there. That was posted in Chalon-sur-Marne, and it was illustrated in Chalon-sur-Marne, July 1916. And this is July 1915. No, it should be 1916. A typo, apologies. At that date, Chalon was very, very near the front line. Uh, so they used to come down in wagons, join up the first station where they could get a train in and bring them in. This is actually a German First World War map. And if you go on the internet, and it's the Ramsey collection, it's got bi-monthly maps of the First World War, the position of the various front lines. Very useful. Most of the postally used cards haven't actually gone through the post or had been sent undercover. I put into an addressed envelope and sent off. But most of them have stamps on, as per this. This is an unnumbered train sanitaire improvised stamp. Now, in all likelihood, that was some form of censorship. Written Bans-le-Bans Visage, which was fairly near the front at that time. There's another one from Bar-le-Duc. Again, different colour, same format. This one had gone through the post without a covering envelope. Now, one of the other marks you turn up, and it's just C215, this straight line train sanitaire improvised. Now, again, it's a John Ball effort. I like the messages on these. They give a weather forecast. But this one is interesting in that it ends with saying that they are about to disinfect the trains, which was a critical thing. And it looks as though, because this was actually Eure-et-Loir, which is, again, some distance from the front line at that time. So it was something that was carried out on a regular basis, this disinfection. Again, C215, it appears to be the same train, but it was different routes throughout France. There's a faint circle stamp on the back, but the straight line mark was the main one. Again, that straight line mark C215, faint mark indicating that it had gone through some form of censorship. Now, I'm assuming that both marks finger trouble. go back. For some reason, my mouse is being very sensitive. Again, Everux in the same marking. If you put these things out on a map, they're dotted all over northeast France, on central France in that case. Now, in conclusion, we go back to the original cover, which has this mark on. We've seen unnumbered marks. This one is clearly marked C7. 7 doesn't relate to the number of improvised carriages, so how that numbering worked, I don't know. But the more ordinary train sanitaire marks, as well as being dumb, i.e. no numbering identification, they can be found with a whole series of numbers for all the various types of trains. I say can be found, they are not at all common in reasonable condition. Anyway, if there's any questions about that service or that cover.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining me this afternoon. What I've prepared really is basically the background to my introduction to stamp collecting, or other stamp collecting of France, and how I've got very passionately involved, therefore, in the stamps of the 1960s. I thought I would give this display in case there were new members to the society who might be interested in collecting and studying a year of stamps such as this, or a decade rather, such as this. But unfortunately, we've not got as many as I anticipated. I apologise, therefore, if I'm teaching grandparents to suck eggs on this display. Anyway, my interest in stamps started way back in 1962 when I was a student in Tours, and I, as a devoted boyfriend and son, wrote letters back to my parents and to my girlfriend of the time. And I popped into the post office in Tours in the Boulevard Béranger, which is a splendid building. But inside there was even something else which was more splendid, and that was the cabinet, which displayed the stamps of France that were being offered at the time. I mean, I am amazed. My mouth just dropped, my jaws dropped at seeing such a wonderful display of stamps in exquisite designs, beautifully engraved. And I immediately decided I was going to pick up collecting stamps again. Sorry, I'm just going to have to move the gallery. That's it. And collecting French stamps was so easy, basically because they were all very cheap. The values were sensible values. The maximum was 1 franc. This was when I was there in 1962. And in 1962, they issued 42 stamps. 40 of them were recess printed like this, or line engraved, and the other 2 were surface printed. But what really hit me was, and you can see them in bold letters there, of the values that were printed in 1962, there were 9 stamps issued that were the 30 centime rate, and 12 values of the 50 centime rate. By far the largest issue of these 2 values, and they were both overseas. 30 centimes was the overseas postcard rate, and the 50 centimes was the overseas letter rate. So consequently, France was, through its postage stamps, was really pushing the culture and sending it a French culture, and broadcasting it abroad. It's not surprising that I was so fascinated by these stamps, because I was interested in art anyway, as one of my other subjects. But I was incredibly fascinated by the engraving of these stamps and the beautiful designs. And clearly I was not alone, because I discovered very quickly that there were a lot of passionate stamp collectors in France who were collecting these issues. And the French Post Office had for many years had a policy, as I said, of promoting France and her achievements through its stamp issuing program. But there were other initiatives, actually. It's not just the stamps that were selling to the collectors, but there were other initiatives from the post office or from the Musée Postal at the time. Here in 1952, for example, 1952, the Musée Postal commissioned a collection of engravings entitled La Poste en France au milieu du XXe siècle. It was a limited edition of 265 copies of a case collection containing 24 large plates measuring 32 by 42 centimeters. And they were printed on vellum paper, and each depicted a postal scene created by the foremost stamp designers and engravers of the time, Pierre Gandin, André Scheffer, Jean Felpin, etc. I've chosen just one example here, and that's plate 21, I think, as it's most appropriate for this display, which is Albert de Cary's depiction of the 10 Chambon rotary recess presses in the Boulevard Brune printing works in Paris. I call them rotary recess presses. The terms recess, line engraved, and intaglio are synonymous, but the French term is taille douce, hence the later reference to TD3 and to TD6 presses. Another initiative in 1951 was the launching of the Grand Prix de la Fitalique. Awards were made to the most attractive stamp, or rather to its designer and or engraver, issued in the previous 12 months from November to November. We may to a degree agree or disagree with the choice of the judges, because here we have the winners in the 1950s, but certainly 3 of the stamps shown here from the 1950s winners have become modern classics. The third stamp along at the top is the 1953 haute couture design by Pierre Gandin and engraved by Jules Pierre. Initially, Gandin was dissatisfied with the issued stamp, arguing that the colour violet chosen for the background, the Place de Vendôme, did not coordinate with the deep blue of the model's gown. Clearly, the judges thought otherwise and gave it the prize. Gandin again created another highly acclaimed stamp, the bottom left-hand corner, in 1955, with his portrait of the Bora Bora girl. She has almost become the personification of the island now, and her image still features on tourist publicity and souvenirs to this very day. YouTuber Graham Beck has created an excellent video on the stamp in his Exploring Stamps series. The third stamp, which is the fourth at the bottom row, fourth from the left, is the Laos elephant, engraved by Jean Felpin in 1958. And it's both a technical and artistic triumph. And we shall learn later how so many different shades of colour were achieved on a 3-colour printing press. During the 50s and early 60s, the French philatelic magazine Le Monde des Philatélistes conducted a series of interviews with French designers and engravers, who by now were becoming celebrities in their own right. Originally published in the magazine, the interviews were periodically reissued in a series of 5 booklets or études entitled Ceux qui créent nos timbres, They Who Create Our Stamps. Each étude contained a limited edition of an engraving by one of the artists or engravers interviewed. And here we see on the right an engraving of a pelota player by Raoul Serre, which had been the subject of his stamp, issued as part of the 1956 sports issue. Furthermore, in May 1963, Le Monde des Philatélistes launched another series of études. These reproduced the Notice Officielle des PTT, the official post office bulletins, which provided details of the stamp's production and the story behind its design, and occasionally portraits of the designers and engravers. 3 copies are shown on the left. Such was the success of this series that in May 1969, Le Monde published retrospectively all the previous bulletins from their initiation in 1950 up to 1961, thereby providing a complete run, even if they weren't published in chronological order. And 2 of these late editions then are shown on the right. The first engraved stamp printed off the Chambon rotary press was the 10-franc Port de la Rochelle in 1929, but it wasn't until 1939 that the first 3 coloured stamp came off the presses, namely the one that you see here, the 90 centime 75th Red Cross anniversary. To achieve a 3-colour printing, the old methods of using the doctor blade or cloths to remove excess ink from the printing cylinder had to be dispensed with, as they would have simply transferred the different colours to the wrong part of the image. In its place, the Serge-Beaune process, named after its inventor, was adopted, whereby an auxiliary cylinder covered in synthetic absorbent material and soaked with a solvent rotated in the same direction as the printing cylinder and gently kissed the printing surface, lifting the surplus ink from the plate without smudging it. If we look then at the diagram in the top right-hand corner, and starting from the bottom right-hand corner of the press, we see the roll of printing paper which initially passes through a humidifier and which moisturizes the paper to make it more receptive to the ink. The paper proceeds to pass between the printing cylinder and the pressure roller. To the right of the printing cylinder, we can see the 3 ink reservoirs and the 3 transfer rollers, which apply the 3 inks to the printing cylinder. This process will be explained in more detail on the next slide. Excess ink is removed by the wiper cylinder below, as I've just explained earlier, and the printing proceeds. The next stage is the printing of the sheet number, the press number, in some cases the date in the sheet margin. After this, the printing sheet is covered by protective paper, which prevents the smudging of any damp ink. Finally, the sheet is perforated, guillotined and stacked in front of the machine operator. This slide explains how the 3 colours are applied to the printing cylinder using 3 rouleaux toucheurs or ink transfer rollers. Top left is a photo of the printing unit extracted from a TD3 press for display purposes. And from top to bottom you can see the white pressure roller, the steel printing roller and one of the rubber ink transfer rollers. In front of the press, mounted in an acrylic casing, again for the purposes of the display, is a bank of 3 transfer rollers and a printing cylinder. The photo at the bottom shows an engraver preparing one of the 3 ink transfer rollers. All 3 rollers receive a printing. All 3 rollers receive a printing of the 25 stamp images in black ink, as shown top centre of the slide. In this case, I'm using Jacques Combet's 1965 40 centime Ronchon as an example. The engraver removes from each roller part of the design, leaving only the sections that were respectively printed in each of the 3 component colours. In this case, the rollers would transfer successively the dark brown, the green and the light brown inks to complete the design as illustrated in the centre of the slide. The marginal inscription in the block of 4 on the right indicates that the stamps were printing on TD3 press number 6. We can now look at some of the artists and engravers who produced the issues of the 1960s. It's inevitable that my choice of stamps will be very subjective, and if you are collectors of this period, you will have your own preferences. Pierre Becquet will be known to you all for his definitive Marianne de Becquet issues of the 1970s. but here are a couple of his pictorial designs demonstrating his skills. The reflection of the Château de Val in the waters of Lake Bourg-les-Orgues is a masterpiece, and the transport of postman design below is an excellent example of perspective, which would not have succeeded if printed in only one or two colours. Next, the Jacques Combé's stamps show his contrasting styles. The European Water Charter issue shows technical skill in his capture of refraction of light through the water droplets. In sharp contrast is his design for La Bourboule, where the view of the town is viewed through rather a Dali-esque interpretation of the window and curtains. Albert de Cary, well known for his Marianne de Cary definitive of the early 60s, has a very distinctive style, often described as being stark, which features in most of his stamps. His own facial features, if you look at the photograph, are long and sharp, and one wonders if characters in his stamps are self-portraits. His pointed nose is ubiquitous. Finally, Claude Durand is a man who can cram so much detail into his work. His Cognac issue, bottom right, is clever in that it combines several different perspectives of the vineyards surrounding the town. I have picked the two stamps by Clément Serveau for no other reason than I just love the palettes. Sorry, I've missed something here. Yeah, beg your pardon. First of all, we see the two contrasting styles of Claude Ertemberger. The 1962 Gobelin issue is like a snapshot, capturing the raising of the heavy tapestry on the right, the proud weaver in the centre, and Louis XIV on the left with his fawning entourage. And below is a purely classical design in the UNESCO series, simple in its form and illumination. Next to him is Jules Piel, who was an old stager born in 1882 and who designed and engraved his first stamp, the 125 Victor Hugo, in 1933. He worked initially with surface printed issues and concentrated more on engraving than designing. He was a prolific worker during World War II, but his main legacy has been the annual Red Cross issue, which he designed and engraved from 1950 through to 1966. He had a good eye for shadow and replicated it successfully, not only in the figure of St. Martin and the beggar, but also below in the bas-relief on the 1963 Trier issue, where the shadow has created a three-dimensional representation. I've picked the next two stamps by Clément Serveau for no other reason than I just love the palettes. Servo's artwork and engraving are exquisite, but the choice of more neutral colours, although not necessarily his personal choice, can only embrace what he has achieved. Many engravers produce their own colour proofs as suggestions, but the final choice was always that of the PTT and the Minister of Posts. Finally, two men who occasionally worked together were André Spitz and Charles Mazelin. The latter more well known perhaps for his post-war Cérès de Mazelin issues. I've chosen two contrasting examples, one full of light, Pope Sylvester II, and one full of shadows, Moissac Abbey. The latter appears to be monochrome, and Stanley Gibbons does indeed list it as black, but the frame is in fact in dark sepia, and the view of the abbey is in dark grey, which succeeds in emphasising the depth of field. As I've said before, collecting stamps of the 1960s is not a problem. They are readily available and very cheap. The challenge, though, with many of these stamps is to find them used alone and at the correct rate. So, from top left, here we see the 10 centimes, L'Hospital, paying the internal printed matter rate. the 30-centime Saint-Étienne Museum, paying the Conchets Postaux withdrawal fee, the 40-centime Charles d'Orléans, paying the French North Africa letter rate, the 50-centime Union of Nice with France, paying the foreign letter rate, the 60-centime Aix-les-Bains, paying the North American airmail printed matter rate, and the 65-centime Dinan, paying the North American airmail postcard rate. Here we have the 85-centime Calais on a contre-remboursement card, the 95-centime Boulogne-sur-Mer, paying the Middle East airmail letter rate to Lebanon. Next to that is a very rare usage of the 1 franc Le Touquet, paying the Overseas Département Europe airmail letter rate from French Guiana to Malta. Then the 1 franc 60 centenary of the Paris pneumatic post, correctly used on a pneu. A 2 franc Nord Atlas, paying the foreign express letter rate to Italy. And finally the 5 franc Caravelle, paying a 3-month subscription for the redirection of mail. You will recall that on slide 3 we saw the Laos elephant issue by Jean Felpin. It was a stunning insomuch that by using only the 3 primary colours of red, blue and yellow, that such a multicoloured image could be achieved. On the left we have a sheet of colour tries for a similar set of Laos stamps from the folklore set, engraved by Felpin later on in 1966. The technician cutting the ink transfer rollers had prepared them in such a way that in some areas of design two colours have been superimposed to create an additional shade. The issued 40 kip value we see here is not from the adjacent colour trials, but from trials using a more muted palette, but the result is the same, a kaleidoscope of shades, just using red, blue and yellow. And I must add here that I'm indebted to Julien Kalkstein for sending me scans of these colour trials. This overlapping process was used with certain French stamps in the 50s and 60s. The 1951 St. Nicholas issue, according to PTT Notice 5111, was printed in blue-black, claret red and yellow. But there are clearly visible hints, due to this overlapping, of orange and green within the design. Stanley Gibbons described it simply as blue and multicoloured. The 1959 Paris Flower Show, according to PTT Notice 59.1, is described as being composed of 5 colours: reddish orange, violet, rose, green and blue. However, only blue, red and yellow inks were used. The green was entirely achieved by superimposing the blue. Stanley Gibbons describes it simply as multicoloured. And bottom right, the 1960 Collège Sainte-Barbe, according to PTT Notice 6029, was printed in red, bister and blue. But looking closely, purple and green are also apparent. Stanley Gibbons states it was printed in red, blue, sepia and bister. Whatever the description, only 3 inks were used. Another way of achieving multicoloured printing is demonstrated here with the Philotex sheet of 1964. In this case, though, each stamp is printed as usual in only 2 or 3 colours. No superimposition of inks has been required. However, to print a sheet of stamps on this scale, the 3 ink reservoirs had to be divided into 5 separate wells, each the width of 1 stamp. The PTT Notice 64.9 records that a total of 7 different inks were used in the printing of this sheet. The photograph and diagram show the ink reservoirs divided into just 3 wells, but the principle for the Philotex sheet is exactly the same. Successfully producing multicolour printings was a challenge for the PTT, and they've been working on it on a solution since the late 1950s. What they produced was the new TD6 press, capable of printing in up to 6 colours, and was a beast of a machine, basically formed of 2 separate presses, working in tandem, each capable of printing up to 3 colours. The 2 presses are indicated as 1 and 2 in the photograph on the left. Press number 1 printed in a new way, a form of offset called taille douce rapport or taille douce indirect. Press number 2 was the traditional TD3 model. The image on the right is one of the trial vignettes designed by Pierre Gondon, and which illustrates the complex design that the TD6 could reproduce. Press 1 operated in a similar way to the TD3, but with the addition of a transfer roller, indicated in red on the diagram on the left. As with the TD press, the engraved printing cylinder received the inks from the 3 transfer rollers, but it did not print these images directly onto the paper. Instead, the images were printed onto an offset cylinder with a smooth synthetic surface. It was from this second cylinder that the paper received the printed design. The paper would then be fed to the second rotary press to receive directly 3 more colours superimposed onto the offset printing. In the photograph on the right, you can clearly see the offset cylinder in the middle, transferring the images from the inked printing cylinder below to the paper above. The first issue to be printed off the TD6 press was the set of 4 bird stamps issued in 1960. However, I have chosen not to show them, but to display instead the Council of Europe stamps, as the contrast between the first TD3 printings of 63 on the left in just 3 colours and the subsequent TD6 printings of 1965 on the right in 4 colours is noteworthy. Thanks to the TD6 press, the Council of Europe flag can now be seen in all its glory with the stars in their rightful colours of gold. The sun also has been filled in with colour. The main beneficiaries from the TD6 presses were the art on stamps printings introduced in 1961. In my opinion, one of the finest stamps in this series was a reproduction of the newborn, with its dramatic use of light and shadow, painted by Georges de la Tour, and which is now hanging in the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Rennes. As a fundraiser, the Postal Museum issued a souvenir card depicting the stages of printing. Firstly, on the left is the background printed by offset or taille douce rapport in red, orange and yellow. And then in the middle, the main feature applied afterwards, in this case just in black, from the recessed printer cylinder. And on the right, we have the finished stamp. Claude Durand was awarded the Grand Prix de la Philatélique for this stamp in 1966. The Art on Stamp series was baptized by the PTT as Le Musée Imaginaire, the Imaginary Museum. The term was coined by André Malraux, who was a French novelist who wrote, amongst others, La Condition Humaine, a member of the French Resistance, an art theorist, and a minister of cultural affairs. He published an essay in 1947 that promoted his concept of Le Musée Imaginaire. It was the term he used to describe a collection of artworks that a person deemed essential or regarded as their favourites, such that, were it possible, they would bring them together in a single ideal art gallery. The photograph on the left is of André Malraux in his study putting his concept into practice. Pierre Gondon embraced the potential of the TD6 press and contributed a number of works of art to the series, including those shown here. We see Jacob wrestling with the angel by Delacroix, which hangs in the church of Saint-Sulpice in Paris. John the Good by Gérard d'Orléans, now in the Louvre. The Bather by Ingres, which is now in the Musée Bonnet-Elle in Bayonne, and the Red Violin by Dufy, currently in the National Museum of Modern Art in Paris. The current location of the Messenger by Braque is unknown. Braque was still alive when the stamp was issued, and the PTT Notice 2761 states that at the time the painting was still on its easel in the artist's studio. It is now held in a private collection. The Card Players on the left by Paul Cézanne was one of the first set of 4 art stamps issued in '61. Due to technical problems, it could not be printed in the anticipated sheets of 25, so only sheets of 10 were issued. Colour trials and printing trials in sheets of 25 of this stamp do come on to the market, but all have the hexagonal annulation overprint, indicating that it is printer's waste. The stained window depicting St. Peter and Sainte Foy Church in Conches on the right is printed in the standard size sheet of 25. Pierre Gondon and Jacques Combet, who engraved the 2 stamps, were awarded the Grand Prix de l'Art Philatelique in '62 and '63 respectively. 3 more artists that contributed to the series were Georges Béton, René Cottet and Jean Felpin. Béton's stained glass window depicting the baptism of Judas Kyriakos is to be found in the Sainte-Chapelle, Paris. It is an example of the full use of 6 colours on the TD6 press, namely yellow, red and green from the offset cylinder, and violet blue, blackish blue and Bister from the engraved cylinder. In contrast, only 4 colours were used for the Philippe the Good portrait. The stamp was marred by confusion over the name of the original artist inscribed below the portrait. His French name is Roger de la Pasture, not Rogier, and conversely his Flemish name is Rogier van de Weyden and not Roger. The painting currently hangs in the Louvre. Cottet's The 14th of July is, in my opinion, a disappointment. The PTT did not have access to the original painting, which was in a private collection in America, nor did it choose to use finished versions painted in bold, solid colours. Instead, the subject of the stamp is a preparatory sketch, now held in the Museum of Modern Art in Paris. A finished version can be seen at the Pompidou Centre. Printing trials that I've seen indicate that 5 inks were used to print Géricault's Officer of the Light Cavalry, and the TD6 printing has successfully reproduced the flames, smoke and chaos of the battle in the background. Renoir's portrait of a model has an alternative title, Portrait of Margot, who was one of his favourite models. That painting is currently in the Musée d'Orsay. I love Jean Felpin's reproduction of Rousseau's Father Junier's carriage. The story goes that Rousseau was in debt to Monsieur Junier, a market gardener from whom Rousseau bought his vegetables, so he offered to paint his family with their new horse and carriage. Rousseau's wife took a photograph, and it was from that the painting was completed. It now hangs in the Musée de l'Orangerie in Paris. And lastly, the Apocalypse Tapestry took Nicolas Bataille and his team of weavers 7 years, from 1373 to 1380 to complete, although different dates are available from other sources. It was originally 140 meters long, illustrating 90 scenes from the Book of Revelation. It currently hangs in the Chateau of Angers. Further examples of the Musée Imaginaire can be seen here used alone on cover. We start with the 50 centime Bonjour Monsieur Courbet by Courbet, paying the foreign letter rate. Then the 60 centime West Window of Notre Dame, paying the foreign letter rate. The 65 centime Madame Manet, painted by her husband, paying the French West Africa airmail letter rate, second step. Cézanne's 85 centime The Card Players, which we've seen before, paying the North American airmail letter rate. The 95 centime Fur Merchant's Window in Chartres Cathedral, paying the internal register letter rate. And finally, the 1 franc Crispin and Scapin by Daumier, paying the concessionary France to Canada airmail letter rate second step. We have already met earlier slides. We have already met on earlier slides 3 of the winning stamps in the Grand Prix de la Philatélique during the 1960s, namely Cézanne's Card Players in 62, the Stained Glass Window of Conches 1963, and Georges Latour's Newborn in 1966. Here we have the remainder. At the top, André Spitz and Robert Camus were jointly awarded the prize for the 45 centime Gorges of Carata in 1960. Claude Durand for his 30 centime Lacordaire in 1961. Pierre Gondon for his 1 franc Lady and the Unicorn tapestry in 64, and Claude Durand again for his 1 franc 30 Chateau of Joux in 1965. On the bottom row, the 1967 award went posthumously to Henri Scheffer for his République de Scheffer. He first submitted this design in competition against the Marianne de Muller design in 1954. His proposals were rejected at the time, but the maquette on the right was resurrected in 1967, 10 years after his death, for the new definitive issue, which became then known as the Marianne de Scheffer. Finally, we have 2 successive awards for Robert Camus, the 25 centime bicentenary of the Union of Corsica to France in 68, and the 45 centime Mouflon in 1969. And last but not least, we must not forget 2 ladies who may have made small but nevertheless significant contributions to the stamps of the 1960s, namely Pierrette Lambert and Mireille Louis. Pierrette Lambert was a prolific designer of banknotes and stamps. Her first banknotes were the 50 franc Racine, issued in 1963, and the 5 franc Pasteur, issued in 1967. And during the 60s, she only designed 3 stamps for France, 2 of which we see here, the 30 centime Chateau of Amboise and the 30 centime 50th anniversary of the victory of Verdun. However, she did design many for Monaco, including the 1963 Children's Charter, for which she was awarded the Monaco Grand Prix de la Philatélique. She retired in 1997, having designed over 1,300 stamps, predominantly for France, Monaco, and the former French colonies. She is now 98 years old and holds the record of being the first woman to design a French stamp. Mireille Louis was the daughter of Robert Louis, a renowned heraldist, whose name became synonymous with the coats of arms stamps issued at regular intervals. He designed all of them from the second series of 1943 onwards. His last design was the 30 centime Paris, which we see here, which was printed in 1963 but only issued in 1965 after his death. The remaining issues depicting the coats of arms of Auch, Mont-de-Marsan and Saint-Lô were designed by Mireille and issued in 1966. She died in 2012 and will be remembered as the designer of the first stamp, 20 centime Saint-Lô, to have been printed with silver and gold metallic inks, which her father would have so much appreciated for his own designs. Thank you very much.